Hello everyone, and welcome to this week's episode of Against All Odds. My name is Daniel Coker, your regular host, and for the first time on this podcast we have a black politician. I'll introduce him and then we'll get into the interview. Our guest this week is Mr. Lee Jasper, who's a British politician and an activist. He served as a senior policy advisor on equalities to the then Mayor of London, Ken Livingstone. And more recently, Lee has been a freelance political, organizational, and communications development strategist. He also happens to be an expert on race relations. Lee is known for his views on institutional racism in the UK police force, and quite regularly appears on Sky News and BBC News, which is actually how I first got to hear about you.
Okay.
Because you came out, you were on Sky News recently.
Yeah,
that's kind of, I said, no, I've got to get this guy on the podcast. And then of course I looked you up on LinkedIn.
Uh-huh.
Okay. Now the interesting thing about Lee, and the reason why I've brought him on the podcast, is that his story is phenomenal, considering that he started life running a market stall, selling second-hand clothes, and returned to education as a mature student, gaining a degree in social sciences from Manchester Polytechnic. I also happen to know that your mum is half Irish and half Sierra Leonean, and I'm actually 1/8 Sierra Leonean. That's where the Coca name's from.
Okay.
Yeah. And your dad is Jamaican, I believe.
My dad's Jamaican. Yeah.
So
well,
Lee.
No,
go on. Yeah, okay. So just tell us, how did you go from running a market stall in up north to where you are now?
Because I had a Saturday school job, which meant I worked on the market stall on a Saturday whilst I was in school.
Okay.
And so I did it every Saturday. It was hugely enjoyable. It was Tommyfield Market in Oldham in Manchester. You've got to be from the Milltown areas to understand the significance of this particular market. But it was an old market, and I used to work there every Saturday selling women's tights. So I was an expert in every shade of golden Sahara brown, and different shades of tights. And then they promoted me away from tights to sell women's clothes more generally. Okay. And so I was very good at selling women blouses, skirts, for their Saturday nights out and so on. So that's how I ended up. I started it. It was first part-time as a school from job, and then when I left school, I did it full-time for a little while. Okay. And before I then moved on and went into, I actually used to work in a factory that made television tubes. Okay. The big television tubes,
old television.
The old things,
right,
back in the
boxy
day.
ones.
Boxy ones, yeah. So we used to put the filament in the back, take out all the scratches off the screens. Okay. We used to have huge imports of them coming in. Okay. Damaged ones, and we'd refurbish them and fix them. So I did some of that from it. So I've done a whole host of things. I worked in an abattoir.
No way.
Yeah. So I was up at. God, you used to be able to. You used to have to start work at 4 a.m. Okay. Because you had to meet the trucks, unload the trucks, get them into the freezer. Good thing you was finished. You were finished by 12, but you had to get up at 4. And it was in Oldham at the time, and everybody knows Oldham in the winter. You can imagine walking knee deep in snow to go to the abattoir, which is absolutely freezing. Then walking into a freezer truck to take the half-seater beef off the hook and carry it into the freezer. So I've done so many different jobs.
You've hustled.
I've hustled, man.
You've hustled
every day.
And the grind. And like I said, one of the reasons why I really wanted you to come on is I could feel your hustle. I could feel that this is somebody who's been through the process. This is somebody who didn't get to where he was with a silver spoon in their mouth. You know, you've definitely gone through a process. So what was it like growing up in Oldham in those days as a person of colour?
Well, I grew up in Manchester, actually. I didn't move to Oldham until I was 9, so I grew up there from 9 till about 19 before I left.
Okay.
So my childhood growing up in Manchester was a great childhood. I lived in Cheetham Hill, which was a sort of, it was one of those communities that was half Jewish and half African. When Jewish people used to live in the inner cities back in the day, before they began to move out further and further. There were Jewish communities where the current day inner city communities are. So if you take Tower Hamlets, that was a Jewish community.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Cheetham Hill was a Jewish community prior to the Bangladeshi and prior to black people coming. So in those times it was sort of half each. So I lived down there with my grandparents, my grandfather from Sierra Leone, who's a member of the Kru tribe.
Okay.
KRU. So I used to have a little turquoise tattoo, which signalled he was a free man.
Okay.
And he absconded on a ship from Sierra Leone at the age of 15.
Oh, really?
And so in the early 1900s, arrived here.
Okay.
They caught him at Liverpool and sent him back on the next ship. Being so resourceful, he got right back on the next ship. And he came and he got through.
Oh, wow.
He lived in Liverpool for a little while.
Okay.
Then he moved up to Scotland.
Okay.
There was a big African growing community in Scotland.
Okay.
And then there was the 1919 race riots. I don't know if you know, but in this country in 1919, the merchant seamen were opposing the fact that lots of African and Indian sailors were coming over to join the British Merchant Navy.
Oh, okay, I wasn't aware of that.
Yeah, and they were opposed to it, and it created a whole host of problems. And there were a series of race riots in port cities, like Aberdeen and Cardiff and Liverpool, and lots of people lost their lives. It was a terrible period in British history. And he moved away from Scotland to come to Manchester as a consequence of not feeling very safe in Scotland. So. And then married my grandmother in 1924, so I have no idea what it was like for an African to marry a white woman in 24. I can only imagine.
Yeah.
It was interesting.
Yeah.
My grandfather was chairman of the local Kru Seamen's Club, so he kept the dues and the subscriptions, and I got all these papers at home. It's fascinating because I'm reading them, and they were having family court sessions, which he would chair.
Right, okay.
So he would say, a woman would petition, my husband's a crewman, he's not here, I have the children. So they would pay the wife some money so that she could survive. So they give her a weekly stipend.
From the dues, by the way.
From the dues. And then they would send people out to go and find a crewman. And then they would literally bring him back. And they would say to him, you're a crewman, you don't leave your children. You're disgrace to the community, you need to support your family. And they forced a lot of men to pick up their responsibilities.
Wow.
So, and I thought, wow. And that's in 1930s, so incredible history.
I'm enjoying this history. Go on.
Yeah, it's fantastic. I mean, he worked on British merchant navy ships, and I got his travel logs. And he was a stoker, so he was in the bowels of the ship shoveling coal into the hot ovens, as were most Africans. They were on the top, and he travelled absolutely everywhere during that period of the First World War, right up into the Second World War. So I don't know how much of the countries he got to see, but I mean, he must have been to at least 40.
That's a lot.
Argentina, Brazil, Australia, all the ports of Europe, and so it's a fascinating history.
So a couple of questions I want to ask you on that. First of all, you mentioned that you grew up in an African and Jewish community, and I've learned a lot from the Jewish community. I must say that a lot of the influence I've had in my life came from affiliation with Jewish people, the way they think, and all that. Was there anything that you'd say that influenced you from growing up in a Jewish neighborhood?
I think so. I think the Jewish neighborhood we were in was absolutely great.
Okay.
I mean, round the corner from where we lived, there's a Jewish factory that made cushions. And in the old days, they used to stuff these cushions with tiny bits of multicoloured foam that they used to just stuff all the cushions with and then stitch them up and sell them. So this guy had a factory room full of multicoloured foam. And he'd let the kids come in and jump around in the foam and have great fun in there. And the sweet shop and the grocery store near I could regularly go in and say, oh, Granny said, can I have 2 tins of beans and whatever I need till next week? And he'd put it on your little chit, and you'd go away, so he extended credit. Others would give us, sweets and drinks. It was a real community that was, and because there were blacks and Jewish people there, when the extreme right wing came to attack either, they'd fight together to protect themselves. Some people don't understand the complexity of our history, but for me, in the Jewish community, growing up in Cheetham Hill and so on, I had a great childhood, and what it did is it predisposed me to Jewish people in a way that I knew they were funny. I love Jewish women, Jewish elderly women, a Jewish mother. I mean, I don't know if you've been to dinner with a Jewish mother.
No, I haven't. No.
Oh, but it's a cultural experience. You have to. I had a great friend in later years, Dr. Richard Stone, and I was part of a Black Jewish Forum, which was about facilitating relations between black people and Jewish, largely informed by my childhood experiences. And we used to have a great Jewish matriarch, whose house we used to go to breakfast for as a Jewish forum. And I just found them absolutely lovely people, delightful, and so on and so forth. So I've always had a great relationship with them, and they've always supported me in terms of my political career. And Richard Stone was absolutely instrumental, because of course he then went on to be a panel member for the Stephen Lawrence inquiry. And that was largely because of my organisation's recommendation that he should be part of that panel. We also insisted that John Santamo, who became the bishop, that he should be part, because their first iteration was an all-white panel. We, on behalf of the family and the wider black community, insisted that it had to be diverse. And because Dr. Richard Stone was a doctor, and I was chair of the Mangrove Community Association in All Saints Road, now very internationally famous, given the recent Small Axe dramatic recreation of the Mangrove trials. He was the only doctor I could call out when young black people were being arrested, beaten, and taken to the police station. We instantly needed medical records to evidence their injury. And he's a doctor I could call out 2, 3, 4 in the morning. He lived in Notting Hill, and he would come anytime, and he would document their history. And if they needed to go to hospital, he'd insist they'd leave the police station and go to hospital. So that's how we came to know him. He supported the development of Mangrove Community Association in Notting Hill, and later he went on to be on the panel of the Stephen Lawrence inquiry. So long association, and we found anti-racist organisations together, national anti-racist organisations. So ourselves and the Black Jewish Forum, we even facilitated a meeting between the chief rabbi and the then leader of the Nation of Islam, which is unprecedented, because they have huge issues. But we, in the spirit of dialogue and communication and understanding, we facilitated that meeting. It's never happened since, but we did it.
So the reason I asked you that question specifically was to try and find out if there's something that you picked up from their work ethic, because I know you work very hard. I've related with you over the past few weeks and in arranging this interview, and I know you're extremely hardworking. Yeah. You're up all hours. You work extremely hard, and I was just kind of wondering if there was anything that you could trace to something that you observed or picked up, in that Jewish community. Or the second question I was going to ask you was, I know you said your grandfather was very hardworking. He traveled up and down the country. He traveled all over the world, about 40 countries and all that. Was there something in your upbringing that taught you the merits of hard work, is what I'm trying to get to?
Yes, in short. I think that my grandfather was somebody who worked all his life until he died. He died of a heart attack. After he finished in the Merchant Sea, he then worked down the mines in the Lancashire coal mines. And he died of a heart attack at 64. But what he imparted to me is that he was an upstanding member of the community. He was chair of the crew, Seamen's Club. People looked to him. He bore that responsibility with dignity and grace. He'd always dress in a three-piece suit when he was going to the corner shop. He was always very dressed. Everybody would be saying, Mr. Jasper, good evening, good afternoon, good morning. So he was a highly respected figure in his community, and he always worked. My grandmother always worked. My father was the first black person to open a off license in Manchester. Okay. So first black business in that direction. Okay. He later went on to open a nightclub called the Carib nightclub in Manchester. So everybody around me was entrepreneurial or industrious. Okay. And what I did find about the Jewish community is they appreciate hard work. So that very chew factory that I first went to, that was owned by a Jewish man called Ken Varley. The company was called Varlectron Limited. And he was Jewish, and I went to work for him. I was promoted in rapid promotion because what I found is that the English workers, I worked fast because it made the day pass quicker. If you're dawdling and clocks ticking slow, I find, look, if I go in and just apply myself, I look up and the day's finished. And that's what I did. But it wasn't the culture in the workplace. So I stood out. The white workers complained, you're working too hard. You're making us like, you got to slow down. And the boss called me into the office, and me and my friend, a school friend of mine who I got a job there also, and he said, look, you guys are smarter than the average cookies. Yeah, you guys can do this job standing on your heads, and you do it quick and you do it to the speed I like. I don't want you to tell anybody else, but I'm putting an extra £20 in your 2 work packets. Keep stum, keep on doing what you're doing. So everywhere, and then one time he took everybody on a works outing, and I happened to get there slightly late with my girlfriend, and they'd gone on the coach, and he took me to the outing in his Rolls Royce. My girlfriend sitting in the back. It's about 18.
How cool that.
So listen, my relationship with the Jewish community is romantic.
Okay. So from there, you then moved to London and moved to the Notting Hill area, and you became.
I moved to Peckham.
Oh, okay. So how did you get involved with?
What I did is, when I left school without any qualifications because I wanted to work, and I had work to go to, and I was living with my mum, not my grandparents at the time, and we needed money, so I went to work and didn't take any GCSEs. So there came an opportunity for me to take a foundation course that was for people who who'd left school without any qualifications. And if you passed this foundation course, you got onto a degree course, and they'd provide you with a grant. And it was targeted at black and ethnic minority people. So I applied and I got on. I did the foundation course. When I did the foundation course, part of the foundation course was learning about black British history. Part of that history was focused on the Mangrove Community Association, Frank Critchlow, and the the whole saga of mangroves development and conflict with the police in that area. When I got a job, my first time I came to London, I applied for 63 interviews when I got my degree in Manchester. I didn't get a single interview. The first 4 jobs I applied for in London, I got an interview for every one. My first interview, I was interviewed by Paul Batang, who's now a Lord and was an MP at the time, and who was the most radical black solicitor around at that time, and Sir Herman Ousley, who was then head of the Inner London Education Authority, and both of them refused me a job.
Did they?
I teased them about it to this day. I didn't get through, but I got through the second one, and it was for a black homeless project in Peckham, and I moved to Peckham. So while I was there, I saw something come across in the mail to the staff to say huge community meeting at the Mangrove, and I thought, that's the same organisation I'd studied. So I decided to go along. When I went along, I was instantly recruited. I stayed there for 15 years as the chair of the community association, secretary of chief steward on All Saints Road for the Notting Hill Carnival, and so that's my involvement. Once I came there, I met Frank Critchlow, who's from Trinidad, who's the most wonderful, ethical, honest, transparent, black man of his age that I'd ever met. He was principled. He was politic. He created a restaurant. He created an old people's home. He created ex-offenders institution, people who were coming out from jail. All of these things. He had a steel band for young people that had, over 60 young people practicing 3 times a week. And he was relentlessly hassled by the police. So that's a whole new story. But that's how I came to get involved in the Mangrove.
So it sounds like you were almost mirroring what you saw your grandfather do in representing a community of sorts. That's kind of, I'm getting that picture.
I get that crude sense that I have the sense that familial responsibility and parental leadership and father leadership in our community is very important. I grew up, with an African in a 3-piece suit who was my grandfather, who everybody paid respect to. I saw how proud he was of the work he was doing, and I saw how disappointed he was with his children who didn't do so well and were straying from the path, and it hurt him greatly. And so there's the African tradition is that everything in your life as you're growing up is a family discussion. So there are times when the family will gather and you'll get advice, strong advice from everybody in the room, aunties, uncles, everybody, and you'll be told about your name, and you'll be reminded of your history of your name. They're reminded of your responsibility to live up to that name. And that's how I grew up. And it was interesting because my father was Jamaican, so didn't have those African traditions, had other traditions. So I suppose I was the original African and Caribbean heritage person very early on in the day. But I got a great sense of leadership, responsibility, moral character, fibre, authenticity from my grandfather, for sure.
One thing I picked up in my research ahead of this interview is that you've fought many battles. You fought many battles, and you're quite vocal about institutional racism and racism in itself. It's quite interesting because you can't really tell what's in somebody's head. And people have gotten cleverer at disguising what they're actually thinking and what they're actually feeling and all that, and how they perceive people of color. How have you managed to fight all these battles?
Well, my mother was my grandmother was a perennial underdog person. So she would always say, anytime you see anything or you see injustice taking place, in the school playground, wherever it was, you stick up for the person who's being bullied. You stick up for the underdog. So she was a big campaigner. My mother was the same thing. She got it from her mother. She's very strong on, no, we don't like bullies. We don't like people who exploit people, and so on. And she would drum it into us, and she would activate it in her life. You'd be walking down the street and you'd see something happening, and as a child you go, oh, mummy, please, no, because you know exactly what's going to happen. And so in she would wave to intervene.
She's going to mess up with somebody else's business.
Absolutely, it's okay. And so I got a lot of that sense of injustice for them. But I have to say, it's a vocation, because it pulls me out of bed every morning. It's something I'm compelled to do. And it's something I've been compelled to do whether I got paid to do it or not do it. I still have to do it. And so I've come to accept it that, hey, you were given a job to do, so I've done it to the best of my ability. Yeah, but it is a vocation. It's not like work for me.
So you had an encounter with, I think, the then commissioner, a guy called Brian Paddock and all that. And he called you all sorts of names, said you're a street hustler. And all. I mean, how did you handle all that negativity and that vitriol that was directed at you?
I think, in one sense, particularly as a younger man, I would take that to heart, and I would have to go and try and convince somebody that I wasn't that guy. So I'd spend an inordinate amount of time trying to convince people who couldn't be convinced that actually you misunderstood me. When I got older, I realised that some people, and particularly people in power, were frightened of me, literally frightened of me, and that's because I have powerful rhetoric. This is a gift from God, of course. Powerful voice. I can sum up, I can motivate, I can fire up a crowd, I can bring it down. It's a gift from God that I've had, is speech, and they knew that. They knew I had rabble-rousing power, if you like, and they were deeply intimidated by it. And so what I find is when people realise you have that sort of innate power, then they fight hard to really marginalise you and undermine you. But from a serving police officer like Brian Paddock, criticism was mild and mute. Because, nobody thought, well, excuse me, I think you'd find there's a lot more criminals in blue uniform than compared to this guy. So it was water off a duck's back. And I think if you're going to survive in the black leadership space, you have to have great resilience. If you're going to carry every inflection, every word, every negativity home, your wife is going to leave you. Your kids are going to abandon you. As you there, 4 o'clock in the morning, trying to convince a troll that, hey, I'm really a nice guy. So in the end, I just gave up. I said, you think what you want to think. My record stands for itself.
Okay. I had this interview. I mean, we've never met before. We have spoken on the phone a few times, and I must admit I didn't know what to expect, because I read something in social media, I read something on Wikipedia out there, I've seen you on TV several times, and I'm thinking, this guy is really radical, he's sort of fearful, but then we meet in the lobby and you're the complete opposite. You're one of the calmest people I've met, and you're not that person that they make it out to be. So which version of you am I seeing today?
And this is the 360 Lee Jasper. Obviously I've matured with age and mellowed with age. So I think you just have to accept that when you've been doing it as long as I've been doing it, which is now 40 odd years, I come into it as an angry 21. So I can't blame everybody for jumping to that stereotype. But as you developed, as you grow older and so on, then you become a lot wiser as a consequence of the wisdom that life teaches you. So where I am, I suppose there's been 7. I've counted 7 Lee Jaspers in my life. Developments of a young man. Growth of. I've got a big family. I have 9 children. My eldest daughter is 50 this year. I have 7 grandchildren and 4 great grandchildren. Because my grandchildren are in their mid-20s now. And why I say that is because I'm a family man, first and foremost. Keeping my family together, making sure they're okay, and being a role model for my family is absolutely important to me. I think the other thing is that the Lee Jasper you see now is the sum total of all that wisdom and learning. And so I feel at the age of 60, coming to 65 now, that I've reached optimum level. Probably later than some others. People learn their life lessons at different times. But where I am now, I feel like I've learned as much as I can learn. And in some senses, I've become even a greater threat to those who would refuse to tackle racism, because in the last 20 years we've seen racial inequality expand and grow, and my criticism of it has had to become more direct and more challenging in order to get traction in political circles.
Do you think much has been done about it, or is it just a lot of lip service?
Yes, a lot of lip service. I think over the last, not to say things haven't improved. I mean, when I first came to this country, you get appalling name. When I first grown up in this country, you get called appalling names at school and on the playground. Your parents and your grandparents would get appalling names on the street, just doing shopping and stuff. And it was, it's horrible. Racism, racist attacks. So it's clearly we've moved on in terms of some of the more egregious aspects of racism. But I find, I'm sad to report that systemic inequality in the private and the public sector has widened during the last 20 odd years, since about 2000. It's got worse. Up to then we were making incremental but still bone-aching progress, given that we've been here for nearly 2,000 years according to the historians. And so progress has been slow, but some progress has been made. The last 20 years have seen what that little progress was eviscerated as we've had a financial crash in 2008, which had a disproportionate impact on our communities, and then the austerity years, which again stripped out resources in some of the most deprived communities, and then pandemic lockdown on top of that. So when you come through that, and you look at the state of the black community, then you can see that on very many social indicators, things have not improved. So, for instance, social mobility. I know there's a podcast about making it against the odds, but social mobility today is less than it was in the 1960s.
Okay.
So the reality is that
what do you mean by social mobility for
the ability to move from one class to another.
Okay.
I'm no longer working. I was born working class. I'm no longer working class. It's very clear. I'm now middle class. But the ability to move, an improved circumstance, income opportunity, to see your children, move on from where you were into higher income brackets and better education and employment prospects. That mobility has reduced. So there are more of us not getting the opportunity within a constrained circumstances, because social mobility, not just for black people, but for all working class, I mean poor people who live in the urban areas, white or black communities, there's some more social mobility has dropped incredibly. So it was easier to make it back in the 60s. The country was on the rise, it was bright, it was optimism,
ownership,
co-ownership, you could buy a house
and all that,
So now I live in central London. I live in an area, Clapham North. When I first moved there 30 or 4 years ago, big house because I've got lots of children, 5-bedroom house, and I told people where I lived, their eyebrows would raise, say, "Oh my God, that's such a bad area, crime is on the border of Brixton, on the border of Stockwell. So all you can see is Brixton, And it's so bad. How do you bring your children up there and so on and so forth? Which I brought all my children, and none of them got into any problems at all. So it shows you it's not where you live necessarily, right? It's the household you come from and the family support that you have will make sure that a kid that would possibly fail in a city area with the right family and the right support can survive. So notwithstanding all the issues about social mobility reducing on the macro scale, there are still things people can do to make sure that they stand a better chance of escaping some of the poverty and low wages and low educational attainment that has affected some of our communities. And even that constituency in our communities is shrinking because it was largely in the 60s a Caribbean descent community, and now it's much more of a hybrid multi-African community. So we now the biggest ethnic groups in the black community are the African community. The biggest projected demographic growth is amongst the African community. So even the nature of the British black community has changed. It was African in the early 1900s. Then it's sort of overtaken by Caribbean migrants in the 50s and 60s in the Windrush. And then about the 90s and the noughties, it then starts to be Caribbean migration is virtually cut off because people need visas. But African nations can still arrive. And African countries then begin to make the demography, the biggest section grow. And so that's where we are. And we've grown. I mean, the African community migration has moved the black community from 1.2% to 4%, I think, in the last 20 years. And it'll grow even further going on.
What are your thoughts about all this conversation about Windrush and the injustice done to those who were never
appalled. I'm furious. I can't. You're a citizen of this country, and you're denied health. You're denied to get a job. You're literally abandoned, and you are a British citizen. And they knew you were a British citizen. The Home Office. They had your papers. Everybody knew you were legitimately here, and yet people went to their graves having not gotten compensation. One of those Windrush victims, Eulene Pennant, died yesterday. She hasn't got her compensation. And I know I could cite very many more. So I'm completely enraged that our community has been subject to the most gross invasion of their human rights and citizenship rights. And you would have thought that once uncovered, people would be keen to make reparation and make good their error and mistakes. And all we've seen from this government is their foot dragging, administrative bureaucracy. The compensation form is 48 pages.
Really?
If you want to sit in front of a Caribbean pensioner who's 80 and say, you need to fill this in order, they're asking for invoices. Or you were out of work in the 1970s, or you were denied your citizenship in the 70s, and you might be claiming because you were unfairly denied in the 70s. They're asking for your living expenses receipts for the 1970s.
Seriously?
Seriously. The 1980s, the 1990s. And if you haven't got it, they won't pay you. So I just think to myself, this is what infuriates me the most. My father, who came from Jamaica, was in the RAF, fought for the Second World, in the Second World War. Thousands of others did, as well as African people from colonial countries from Africa. It made the ultimate sacrifice. Our mothers went into the NHS. They saved the sick and the injured and the disabled coming back from the Second World War. They stuck it out. Our fathers came out of the army and went into transport and made sure Britain was running. We literally rebuilt the country for after the bombings and the mayhem of the Second World War. And to say that those same people who'd made that ultimate sacrifice then be denied citizenship, cast out in the cold, left abandoned, some of them homeless, wandering the streets because there's no recourse to any public funds or money. Their families, and it even goes because once you do not have your citizenship, you find out that when your children decide to go to university, they can't go because they can't prove they're British, even though they're born here. No, these things are horrendous, and I'm absolutely incensed by the Windrush scandal. It's the most fundamental breach of our human rights in modern human history, and frankly, I'm gobsmacked that we are very much more angry about the injustices that people are still suffering, and they're still suffering from today, because when you check the Home Office about how many people have actually been paid by compensation, you can see that from the estimated number of people affected, less than 30% have applied for compensation. Okay. So there's 70% of people out there who are eligible, who won't even fill in the form. And they won't fill in the form because they think they're going to be deported again. They think these people, well, I've done this to me all these years and tried to deport me. If I give them all my information now, I'm not sure they'll use it in the right way. And so people are frightened. Suspicious and frightened. So, yeah, Windrush, terrible scandal. Terrible scandal.
You've written extensively about the black community taking responsibility for the increase in teenage and community violence. What practical steps do you think can be implemented to reduce crime in underprivileged communities?
I think we've got to give much more support to struggling parents. If you're a single mum on an estate and you're working 2 jobs, you can't see in the morning till can't see at night, your kids are what we used to call latchkey kids, they have to come in and feed themselves after school because you're still at work. These are incredibly difficult circumstances for low-income earners. And of course, that when your child's left to their own devices, the devil makes work for idle hands. And so we need to give much more support to parents, that give them the skills and that they need to be able to bring up children whose natural inclination is not to want to harm people. But what you find in poorer communities is violence is contagious. So if you've been a victim of bullying, you're more likely to bully other people. If you live in a household where domestic violence is prevalent, you're more likely to be a domestic violent abuser. What we know about the psychology and culture of violence is it's contagious. So you can demonstrate this, can't you, by just going to any action movie on a Saturday afternoon, particularly if you're going to African or Caribbean theatre, you get the running commentary of the audience. But you see an action movie and you all of a sudden you feel hyped, or you feel a sad movie and you want to cry. Emotion is contagious, and violence is an emotion. And so what you find is that in poorer communities who are challenging circumstances, that their ability to be able to support and develop and take care of their children is severely limited. On the Caribbean side, it's less so on the African side, but on the Caribbean and Black British descent side, there are far too many children without fathers that are engaged. If you've been abandoned by your father or your mother, then I talk to children who feel that way, and there's a heart-shaped hole in their life that cannot be filled because this trauma has such an effect on them that it's completely brutalized their psychology. What would be their normal development is interrupted by this trauma. This trauma is contagious, and so what you find, and poor communities can be quite violent places, either in their schools or on the streets. And what you find is the violence as a virus infect people. The way to tackle it is early intervention. We need to make sure that parents are supported. We may need to make sure that in schools there is the lessons that are around not just the classics, but in fact how you should behave as a constructive member of society, your ethics, your human values. What does compassion look like in your community? What are the realities of violence and where can it lead? And I think these life lessons are very important for our young people who, in the absence of families, because in a big African family you've got every life lesson you need. There's always somebody who's done something or knows somebody who could give. I was there. Right? I can tell you. So that's the resource that families give you. But if you haven't got that, and you've got somebody who, say, your parents are born here, and they haven't had that wider familial cultural induction into African or rural Caribbean cultural practices around family and growth, so you become isolated. Our families, we're not just mum and dad and children. We're mum, dad, children, aunties, uncles, grandparents. Everybody's in that. It's not a nuclear family. But when you come here, you're pushed into the nuclear. If you don't know the bigger thing already, then you think the nuclear thing is where it's at, and often those break down. So that early intervention, but also look here. People keep saying, oh well, we're a poor community and so on and so forth and so on, and we are relatively underpaid rather than we should be. But we've got huge resources we could put our way, and I was saying to our community, look, if you're waiting for the Home Office to give you a grant to save our children, that's not going to happen. And even if it does, those children are not going to respect you for it, because they know in their hearts you're here because you're being paid, and if you wasn't being paid, you wouldn't be here. Right? That's a totally different relationship. And what I say is, what we say is that we have to fund these these are our children. If you can't invest in saving your own children, nothing's going to help you. That group, that community, it's going to see mayhem in its young people. And that's what I believe in. I believe that everyone, your child is my child, my child is your child. If you see my children on the street doing something they shouldn't be doing and they're going to get themselves in trouble, I would hope that you would intervene and say, look, no. Because that's the accountability I had when I was growing up. By the time I did something wrong, I would head home. Before I got home, my mum knew all about what I did to them. And she knew every dot and comma. And if I lied or tried to massage it in some way to make it sweet, change the narrative, no sir. Woman had forensic intelligence.
You've received several awards for your activism and contribution to stamping out racial inequality. But my worry, just listening to you this today, is that do you see a younger generation of people, picking up the work that you've done and taking it to the next level? I mean, I don't hear of Lee Jaspers.
I do. I mean, when you look at the Black Lives Matter in 2020, throughout the country, young leaders popped up. Everybody was Spartacus. And so we had young leaders, and I've been working with a group of young people, both in terms of entrepreneurial development, people who want to get into business, establish so on, working with that. And I've also been working with, a Black Lives Matter group who want to consolidate the Black Lives Matter movement. And so what I find myself in now is a sort of Grand Vizier, advisor role, because I'm not seeking to lead anything at my grand old age. But I feel like for me to ethically sign off, if I'm going to retire, if I'm going to ethically sign off, I want to have created institutional processes and opportunities for learning and development that give this next generation all the skills and tools they need to navigate what will be quite a challenging future with climate change and the economic situation facing the UK currently. So, and I'm also very keen to say to our community, look, the African continent is open for business. It's open for business. You're not stuck in South London or wherever you are. You're with an internet. These days, you can do amazing things from your bedroom. And what we do is, through a network I'm involved in called Black Men for Change, they have a program called Future Boss, and this Future Boss opens up people's eyes to the opportunity that there is to work on the African continent. Takes young people here to the African continent to meet with their business counterparts over here, brings those ones from Africa over here. We just had a delegation over here in last 2 weeks, and push them together in the hope that they make business. And we've seen that happen. So we're trying to say to young people now, the world is your oyster these days, and particularly with new technology, the world is definitely, the sky's the limit.
In the light of recent riots in Paris following the shooting of an unarmed black man, how would you say racism in England compares to racism in other European countries, just from experience?
I think Britain has the most. I think Britain has the most politest racists in the world. Really.
Okay.
Yeah. So you can be sort of killed by kindness in the United Kingdom, you know. And so British culture dictates that, you know, there's certain protocols in relation to communication, and you will always receive a smile and how are you and you okay, and then when they leave, you know, they talk with their colleagues in a rather different tone about your dark self. So at least with the French, they are open and brutal. Yeah? There's one France, yeah? And everybody's French, and that's it. No black, no white, no nothing. And so that's it. Well, what they, you know, both countries suffer from the colonial legacies of their past. France, particularly with Algeria and some Senegal and other French colonies, and Britain with, you know, Jamaica and Barbados. So each has that colonial legacy, and they found it enormously difficult to come to terms with that colonial legacy, and therefore the people who live in those countries have found it enormously difficult to feel genuinely part of what society. It means to be French or to be British. And I think because people deny that colonial legacy, it blinds them to the reality of systemic racism as it is today, and that reality marginalises and isolates our communities away from.
Is there any successful person, dead or alive, that you admire, and why?
Loads. I admire Stephen Hawking. I mean, you know, you talk about a man with challenges, overcoming challenges, and then delving into the mysteries of the universe, and pushing Einstein's work on. I mean, come on, that's amazing. So people like him. I love sports people. You know, big fan of Muhammad Ali, knew him personally, looked after him for 4 days when he came to the UK in 2000. So I had the honour of being with him for those 4 days. Politicians, clearly Mandela, you know, Thomas Sankara, Nkrumah, and people like Reverend Jesse Jackson, Reverend Al Sharpton, who I know very well. I have a whole range, and not just one category either. You know, I love Rabbi Blue, who was a Radio 4 commentator for many years before his sad death. Give you that thought for the morning, and he was part of the Black Jewish group, so we had great conversations with him. There's so many people. I'd have to write a book about the people I really admire.
So Lee, I know you kind of touched on it briefly earlier on, but what motivates you?
I think a passionate commitment to justice. I want to see people treated fairly. I think I've have a strong ethical dimension to my work. By that I mean I have to do the right thing. The right thing can sometimes be very difficult, but you're going to need, if you're going to set the tone and the tenor and the foundation, then you're going to have to get used to doing difficult things. And I've made a virtue out of identifying what is difficult for me or what I'm frightened of and conquering it. So I always do the thing I don't like to do first, because I say if you can do the thing you don't like to do regularly, then the thing you want to do is a breeze.
So I'm going to ask you, what keeps you up at night? What fears have you had?
Climate change. Climate change. I'm horrified about climate change. I mean, I take a particular interest in it, and I see the massive impact. Well, the United Nations predicts 800 million Africans will be on the move in 10 years' time due to climate catastrophe, war, famine and drought that follows on, water shortage, food shortage and everything else. And that's got to be a existential threat to the whole of humanity. That keeps me awake at night. Because I think I'm 65, I'm going to be passing on, but my grandchildren, what kind of environment are they going to face? I'm not going to be here. So that one keeps me awake at night, for sure.
So, as we round up this conversation, what do you think of this podcast and what we're trying to do?
I like it because, I'm an avid reader. So I read autobiographies of people, particularly where they've not so much, shooting star success and, came from the bottom and went to the top. I like to read the ones where they go to the top, then they come down, then they bounce back. That's fascinating.
Yeah.
And you hear the pain of their suffering, their commitment to overcome the strategies that I apply. I love all of that. So I'm an avid reader of biographies, and I think they've got enormous lessons in life to teach you if your mind is open to things. And that's why I always try and stretch myself into other communities, because other communities have got things to teach you. As I say, with the Jewish community, I could talk about my relationship with the Bangladeshi community over the years, equally insightful, equally instructive. My relationship with the African community, whether it's from Nigeria or Ghana, equally. And what I find is that human experience through different cultural groups is just like a Timbuktu University of life lessons. You just got to go out there, and if you can listen and hear, and they can give you the time, you can learn some amazing things from other people. I always like to think I'm the least intelligent person in a room, because I always know somebody out there has got something to teach me. I just need to find it.
Is there anything else that you'd like to talk about on this podcast that perhaps we haven't covered?
No, I think you've covered a lot. I'm going forward doing lots of legacy work now about building the foundations so this next generation can hopefully learn from our experience and help shape their decisions about their own futures going forward. I'm doing a lot of international consultancy on ethical governance in West Africa and some around organizational development with African American community and pulling together some global initiatives around the African diaspora. So still doing lots, still doing the legacy work, and I'm on the internet all over, so just look me up. I'm easy to find.
Okay, final question or final thing is we have a tradition on this podcast where we give our guests the opportunity to say thank you to anyone, just dedicate this podcast to anyone. I mean, who would you like to dedicate this episode to today?
Too many people, but can I go for it?
You can go for it.
I'll dedicate that to my grandfather and grandmother in Manchester, and my parents, my sisters and brothers of wider family, Jewish communities, Bangladeshi communities, African communities with whom I've had great relations over the years, white anti-racists who distinguished themselves by their commitment for equality. The universe for supporting me even when I've met severe challenges and been really down. The universe has kept me positive. My wife, who's an absolute angel, how she put up with me for all these years, I do not know. But I deeply love, respect my wife, and whose good counsel has, served me well and our entire family well over the years. My children, who are an absolute credit to me. And then I've got a list of people: Viva Moon, Dave Weaver, Rita Patel, Mina Dolby, Audrey Adams, Stafford Scott, I could go on, Leroy Logan, Jeremy Crook, Jake Fergus. There's a whole milieu of people out there. Cheryl Seeley, Arlene Mundell, who's now passed away, but was a Maroon warrior. When I say I have to write a book to thank the people that I need to thank in my life, I really do. And it's because everybody's got something to offer.
Well, Lee, on that note, thank you very much for coming today.
Thank you.
And if you've enjoyed this episode, I'd like to do a couple of things for me. I believe we've crossed 500 subscribers today. I think so. And for those of you who are watching this for the first time, this is a podcast that I started earlier on this year, purely by accident. I was telling Lee earlier on, I'm not a trained journalist. I'm a chartered accountant, and this is completely new to me, and I'm kind of learning as I go along. And to help us to take this to the next level, you can do that by subscribing. It's really, really important. And then also leaving comments. So there's a comment section below. If you can leave some comments, like this video as well, and then share this video with as many people as possible. I know Lee has over 16,000 followers on LinkedIn who are all going to see this video. And I mean, together we can help take the legacy that people like Lee have fought for over 40 years or 50 years, you know, and improve the outcome for the next generation. And all it takes might be your subscription. You might never get a chance to, you know, sit anywhere or influence people like Lee has, but then your subscription will give us a louder voice, and that in itself will make a difference. So Lee, thank you very much, and I'm really humbled that you've made time to sit with us against all odds today.
No worries. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Cheers.